if there's any reason I was relatively successful with working with these prison guys was I tried to be kind to them, interested, empathetic, and that goes a long way with wherever I was seen in psychiatry.
Hello, everybody.
Oh,
John Atack and my lovely friend Dr. Jazz, Stephen Moffic. How are you today, Steve?
good, thanks. Sort of coming out of a cold, and computer trouble. So I apologize to the audience if I'm not coming through very well, but we'll do my best.
Good. And it's nice to see you wearing your Olympic shirt from it. Was that the last time you competed in the Olympics?
Me? So yeah, this was back in 1980, right?
Mm.
So uh, I, I I've been wearing it while the regular Olympics was on, and now the Paralympics was on, which in some ways interests me much more.
Mm.
So I'm trying to keep the tension going on the Paralympics. I would love to go see the Paralympics
Mm.
someday. So we'll see. It's coming to Los Angeles in a couple of years, just like the regular Olympics. So maybe it'll be feasible to get tickets, and maybe I'll still be alive and well enough to go. We'll see. But I think I think before we got on the air, you were talking about post traumatic growth. Well,
Mm.
if there's people that have post traumatic growth, those who've had developed disabilities or have them their whole lives
Yeah.
are certainly among those who have that potential. And Olympics is one way. Many of them are showing it. Just
Mm.
incredible, I think.
Yeah, it's just shining examples to us all, that whenever I feel like grumbling, and that's actually quite frequently,
Yeah, right.
whenever I feel like grumbling,
Yeah.
I do think, I do realize that I've had an incredibly blessed life.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and particularly so in terms of my friends. And I'm very grateful to have you as one of my friends, Stephen.
Yeah. Same here, John. And
Um,
especially, I would emphasize friendships as we become elders. Like me, I'm approaching my 80th birthday, and friendships get more and more important, but also harder to do as we age because first of all, some friends die out, old friends. Very hard to develop new friends of any type when you get to be my age, and so they're precious. But if there's one thing that really helps people, one thing that you can isolate that really helps people's health and mental health when you get to your 70s and 80s, it's relationships.
yeah.
And if you get new ones that are good, you can just really count your blessings. So I appreciate what you just said and in our relationship, even though it's long distance, but this is one of the great things about technology, which I criticize a lot, technology, but not for this. So
No, I couldn't agree more. Technology is awful, but it does allow us to do miraculous and wonderful things. And as you say, as you know, for 40 years, I consider myself a Buddhist. I wasn't part of a Sangha I didn't go to meetings, but I meditated and I read all of the Digha Nikaya, the scriptures. Um, and then about a dozen years ago, having, lusted after enlightenment for 40 years from the age of 17 or so, it just all dissipated. It was all gone. And I felt a great deal happier that I didn't have to have this self-criticism and guilt all the time about not having achieved the state and just accepting that I was never going to achieve it. And that was that. But it, what replaced it, and it happened in a moment. I can even remember where I was walking down the street in the village here. And I just went, what's important is relationships.
mm,
We're part of a network, and since then, the whole idea of the fear of death and the poor little individual being annihilated rather than living forever and lighting up the sky with my name or something, that very idea, the narcissism of immortality, fell away. And
Mm.
what became relevant was how connected are we and how much are we a part of humanity and how can we show our humanity? Um, and from that day on, although there have occasionally been difficult times, I admit it, but from that day on, I've felt comfortable in the world. And it's
Yeah,
about having friends and it's about being friendly and also about trying to limit that a little bit. I do realize that I've taken on rather too many, more people than I could eat. I've bitten off more people than I could eat over the years. And because just about anybody who came along, I do what I could to be friendly with them. Now I'm more selective. And so I know people like you, Stephen, who I love and admire. And we get to every couple of months sit down and have one of these winding conversations, which will always reveal something new. So it's
yeah.
wonderful. And that does relate to what I was thinking about. It suddenly struck me last night that when my oldest boy, who's now 40, when he was at school and was having sleep trouble, and wasn't able to get into school, there was an education welfare officer. They used to be called child catchers or truant officers, but now they're called education welfare officers or EWOCs, as I think of them. And she, on the phone, she said, "Well, he's got to go to school to get an education." I kind of went, "No, he hasn't.
Mm.
That's not true." And in fact, he didn't. He was homeschooled and he has two master's degrees now. So I think he's proved the point.
Yeah,
Um, but I'd never really thought about it. And I think therapy is another of those things that is like, if it's not with a therapist, then how can you realize anything? And it's sort of, but life can be therapeutic. Our friends can be therapeutic. We can have realizations and insights that transform our lives. And it just seemed, it's not an original thought, but that we've tended when I talk to people who are in therapy, particularly somebody who's sort of spending, I've heard of up to 8 years, 3 times a week, having
hmm,
analysis. And it's a friend of mine, he had 5 years of analysis. And at the end of it, the analyst said, "No, I think we're done. You should spend more time with your children." And he'd just given away 5 years of his young children's lives when he could have
hmm.
been spending the evenings with them.
Yeah.
And instead,
That's
he was learning about his libido.
that's fascinating. It makes me think back to my medical school days because, yeah, most of our teachers at that time were psychoanalysts, and with my brash confidence, being a young person at Yale Medical School, I said in a different way, in a nicer way, I think, why do you guys spend so much time with so few patients? There's so many people that might really need psychiatric help, and you have what, maybe 10 patients total
Yeah.
because you see them so often. And and one of the guys said, well, we see leaders in society, so if we help them get better, we're helping many other people.
That worked.
So that sounded good. I'm not sure it's really true.
Well, it
First
doesn't
of all,
seem to have been, does it, given where we've ended up?
and even getting better over that time is questionable. I back then the recommendation was that psychiatrists get as much personal therapy as possible, whether you were having personal trouble or not, because that would help you understand patients and it would protect patients from your troubles and so forth. And I just decided I wasn't going to do psychoanalysis, in part because of the example you just brought up. It takes you so much away from your everyday life, not only an hour spent, but you're thinking about yourself all the time.
Mm.
So I decided not to do it. Fortunately, my wife, who Rusty,
Mm.
is a natural therapist. So I get whatever I think need from her over the years, and it's worked out, I think, fine. Not
Mm.
that I don't have some major problems, but um, but that's life. None of us come out perfect. If we sort of appreciate our own problems and find ways to either get around them or have them not have such major effects, that's fine. And so Yeah, I think in-depth psychoanalysis, I guess it has its place, but it's in many ways is often a waste of time. And that's what Freud said, actually. He didn't think psychoanalysis was going to be a viable treatment. I think
Mm.
people don't understand that. It was a way to try to understand people, but he never thought it was going to be a useful therapy. So
Oh,
he gets a bad rap with that. So
yeah, and because he never had any analysis himself.
well, himself was his analysis, his interpretation of dreams, right? All the stuff he did to try to understand himself. I think that's viable, but it's very difficult because, we sort of protect ourselves from seeing the
Mm.
worst in ourselves. So, but, he tried it in his own way, kind of a self analysis, sort of what Jung did too. That I think Jung's was much more problematic.
Yeah,
Um,
the Red Book. Yeah.
yeah,
Whoa.
yeah.
Yeah. So if you're therapist, it's like if you're a lawyer that you'll be the worst lawyer you can have.
Mm,
And I think if we're talking about systems where there are meant to be subconscious things going on, and I mean, with Jung, the shadow and or the anima animus, all of this sort of bizarre stuff going on. How on earth are you meant to see that? And once you've come up to the idea of projection, how are you going to see through that?
yeah.
So, I mean, I won't go on too much about it. I've read Frederick Kreuser's book on Freud. It's not the only one, but he is chapter and verse as to all sorts of peculiar things that are going on in Freud's world. But
Mm,
the 4 hours that he spent with Gustav Mahler, as you know,
mm,
I'm a huge fan of Mahler. And at the end of 4 hours, two things happened. Freud declared that he had given him a complete analysis, which he elsewhere said took years. And he told the world that Mahler's problem was impotence, which, in terms of client confidentiality, was not very good work. But there we go.
that's true.
Do as I do, don't do as I say. That's the law of this. So yeah, therapeutic encounters. You also, because of Rusty, you've had the therapy of joy. You,
Yes.
yeah, and so and isn't that so important? I mean, I'm in a fantastic, loving relationship this last 6 years, and my wife and I, we argue, we do all of that stuff, get very annoyed with each other. I am a very annoying person, as you've probably worked out by now, but we always sort it out. And it's not like any of the other relationships I've had in my life, where the simplest thing is to say that I was with people and it didn't work for us, So,
Mm,
uh, I was not right for them, they were not right for me. So having somebody who loves you, being able to rely on that, and having somebody that enjoys your company and likes to spend time with you and wants to go and watch some jazz or listen to some Mahler. We saw Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes on Friday, and I've never seen an opera before. I've not even watched one on the telly. Opera. Ugh. But I became so fascinated with
mm,
Benjamin Britten. There's a documentary by Tony Palmer called A Time There Was about Britten's life. And I've been listening to bits and pieces of Britain over the years. You go, oh, that's a bit complicated for me, above my pay grade. There's the solo for tenor and horn, sung by Peter Pears, his partner, which is I've known that for years, and that's very beautiful. Jeff Buckley on Grace does the Corpus Christi Carol, which is a Benjamin Britten work.
mm.
But to see this whole kind of 2.5 hour opera, it was really amazing. It was really,
Oh, yeah. And it's such a great opera. I mean, and in some ways, more than most operas from the past, is almost a realistic story.
yeah,
Um, you know, it could happen in life, and horribly so, but it could happen in life. So, some opera stories are just so off the wall. You just have to sit back and listen to the music and
mm,
so forth, but not that one. That's
mm,
it's so gripping. I think I think we saw it 2 or 3 times. Um, can just affect you so emotionally and feel so sad about what happens. And
Mm,
um, but what happens there? An individual getting harassed by outside society around
mm,
him, and hard to know what he contributed to the tragedy. But just a fantastic opera, and actually, maybe what I like as much as the story is these four, what are they called? C interludes between like the movements. Those are
mm,
so gorgeous as
yeah.
a separate piece of music.
Mm,
Could just listen to them over and over. I think they last maybe total 15 minutes
yeah.
together. Just beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, the two ends of therapy exist there, that there's that which lifts us up and makes us feel joyful, and we transcend our everyday emotions. And there's that which is cathartic, which
Mm-hmm.
helps us to let go of. And so, I mean, I was about 13 when I realized that it was possible to listen to very sad music and cry and feel better. you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, over the years, when it came out, I got Joe Cocker's album, I Can Stand a Little Rain, which came out when I was about 18. And if ever I needed, a cry, I would put that on,
Mm-hmm.
sing it at the top of my lungs, with no neighbors listening, and get it out of my system. Led Zeppelin's "Since I've Been Loving You" is a very good sort of anthem for.
Yeah, didn't Joe Crocker do an amazing version of I'll Get By with a Little Help from My Friends, the Beatles song, which we were mentioning friendship before. His version might, if I remember right, is the best of any version, I think.
It
So,
was it was one of those real breakthroughs. He that was the song he came through on. It mentioning Led Zeppelin, it was actually Jimmy Page who played the guitar on that,
oh,
and the organ arrangement, Chris Stainton, who stayed with Cocker for years, and Cocker just kept on. He just, right to the year that he died, he recorded another album, great album. I can't remember what it's called offhand, and went on tour and did recorded a DVD of that album, still with all of that power and that grumble. He said that when he talked with other singers, that he'd always just wanted to sing. That was that. He just wanted to sing, and he talked with other singers, and they wanted to be famous. And he was like,
yeah, right.
"What?"
There's a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and you get it. When you listen to Nina Simone or Ray Charles or Louis Armstrong or Miles Davis, somebody who really means what they're doing. That difference between that and a celebrity performer. So it's quite something. So yeah, the arts are something that can definitely give us this therapy. Post-traumatic growth, we talked, we did a piece about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and last year, the year before, I think it was last year, because there was this guy Jamie Mustard selling this, get a jab in your stellate ganglia of anesthetic, and that will cure your PTSD. And that, firstly, the idea that we're machines that can just go to the shop and have a fix, that we don't have any part in what we think and feel. It's just, we're just physiological, with the mistake that we are hardware, which he's actually said. And of course, we're not hardware, we're wetware in computer terms. We have both, because we're not rigid and solid, we grow and change. Physically, we grow and change, so we're wetware. And the thought, he said to me point blank, I've talked with about 600 people as they've come out of groups, largely Scientology, and helped them. Well, I hope I've helped them in their recovery. And he said, you haven't helped anybody because it's a hardware problem and you've got to fix it in this way. And it was sort of that threw me into reading more about post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, and kind of going, well, it's just not true. That who you are to start with, how resilient you are to start with, which is partly genetic, but it's also I think, partly to do with attachment. If we bring John Bowlby and another ex-Freudian into it, who says, if you have a good attachment as a child, then you're much more likely to be able to cope as an adult. And I think many adults don't have an attachment. They grew up in an unloving environment, an uncaring environment, and so they didn't develop those skills, and they suspect everyone around them, because that's what they had to do as kids. So there's that part of it, but there's also the part of it of the environment you're in now. Do people care about you? And we've
Hmm.
created a punitive society, really. I mean, it's not great here, but in the US, the way the prison systems work, where they hothouse criminals, make them hate the society even more, and make it likely that they will do harm. So we have what about 80% recidivism out of American prisons. About 4 people out of 5 will commit another offense.
Yeah, I worked in one of them for a while. Yeah, it's more or less what you said, and what struck me the worst. It was overrepresented with young black males, not
Oh yeah.
surprisingly, and most all of them were diagnosed with sociopathy. And sociopathy, you can't help very much. And so, what the psychiatrist I was replacing did was just give them some benign sleep medicine. So, obviously, it didn't really help at all. It made them quieter at nighttime. Um, but I found if you were interested in them and curious about their lives, what you found out is that most of the time they had post traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And in trying to cope with the trauma that was all around them growing up, they ended up in criminal areas often. It
Mm.
was one way to make more money. And so they were amenable to getting better, whether that was through new relationships or therapy. But you could work with them and they potentially could get better. It was just a bad understanding of what they went through in life. And um, but that's common in prisons. They're thought to be just hardcore criminals, and that's all. And they can't get better, and you can't help them. But it's not true. Not true. Best you can do is actually help the communities where these people come out of because they're so full of trauma. It's amazing who gets through them successfully, to have a good life
Mm.
because there's so much to overcome growing up.
Yeah. I just rewatched The Wire. I think it's the fifth or sixth time that I've seen it all the way through, all 5 seasons. I think it's the Shakespeare of our time, that and 6 Feet Under, a few other things. And there you have this insight about why Baltimore is a chaos.
Mm,
The education system, the way the newspaper functions, the political system, and of course the drug problem.
hmm.
And the attitudes of mind and what might change something. So there's one study that I'm aware of, the Mendota study, where which is in Wyoming or Wisconsin. Forgive me, it's in one of those
Yeah,
W
like
states.
equivalent of a state hospital in Madison. Yeah,
Yeah,
Capital.
okay.
Yeah.
And they had a program where they had juvenile offenders and they separated them into two groups. One would get the usual treatment, and the other fundamentally got a lot of care and attention. And in the follow up, I think there were 17 murders in when they let out those who'd had no help in that group, from that group, and there were none in the group that they had cared for. And that didn't speak loudly enough to say, you know, maybe kindness is a virtue. Maybe
Exactly.
being punitive and
Yeah.
derogatory and violent towards people who are distressed is not good. Let me say, I do believe that Hannibal Lecter needed to be in a mask. That it's not a matter of being soft on such things. It is a matter of not being hard on them. And so if you've got a Ted Bundy or a Jeffrey Dahmer or Ken Bianchi or
Yeah.
whoever,
Now
you
those are
need
sociopaths
you
and
need to lock them
essentially,
up.
yeah, essentially can't help them.
But you
But
shouldn't hurt them, and it
no,
won't make the world a better place by doing that. I mean,
right.
I've just finished Nicholas Schreck's Manson file, which, if it was published in paperback, would be longer than The Lord of the Rings or War and Peace. It's an immense book, and Schreck spent 25 years getting to know Manson. He met him, I think, first in touch with him in 1985, and going through all of the mythology about Manson. And I don't fully agree with his conclusions. I don't think that Charles Manson was a shaman, which is the term he uses for him. But okay. On the other hand, I do think he was railroaded, and the attitudes, he deserved to be in prison for the things he had done, but he went to prison for things that he hadn't done.
Mm,
And in reading about Manson, that's the 15th book I've read about Manson, you find out, because I'm writing on it, not because I've got an obsession about Charles Manson. I've been writing a book, I'm working on a documentary about it, honest. Um, but seeing the way that different people personify him, and and still coming to this point of view, well, he had the most awful childhood.
mm,
He's 4.5 years old. His mother goes to prison for her part in what was called an armed robbery. The weapon was actually a ketchup bottle um, in his brother's pocket. But she goes to prison. He gets put with his vicious uncle, who, so on his first day of school, he's 5 years old. He comes back crying. And so his uncle makes him wear his cousin's dress.
mm,
Now, his cousin, he's a small 5-year-old, and his cousin's a regular size 8-year-old. He has to go to school because he's a crybaby.
mm.
And that sort of attitude,
Humiliating. Yeah, yeah,
you know, so it's no tremendous surprise that we end up with somebody who, by his own admission, it's on tape. He says that he worked as a hitman for the mob in Mexico in the 1950s and killed people. So
mm,
he didn't go to prison for that. He went to prison for murders that he did not commit. And I mean, he was there when Donald Shea was killed, and he was certainly an accomplice in the Tate LaBianca
yeah,
killings and the
yeah.
Gary Hinman killing. But it going through all of that material and just seeing the awful way that people treat one another and going,
Right.
well, what do you expect? We had a reform school here called Pepper Harrow in the early 1970s. And there's a beautiful documentary about it. And they came back, I think, 20 years later. And I think there'd been 6 pupils in that were focused on in the original documentary. And one of them had died since, and one of them didn't want to participate. But the other 4, you got to see them again. And the one that really struck me was this 14-year-old. He was the youngest of 4, sorry, the oldest of 4 kids. His siblings were all by different fathers, none of whom had taken any responsibility. So he was caught stealing because he was trying to feed his mum and his siblings. That's why he was a thief. He could not read and write. He'd not been to school. He was 14 years old. And at Pepper Harrow, their whole policy, they were hippies. What can I say? Their whole
Mm,
policy was tolerance. So I remember being shocked watching it. There was an 8-year-old walking around smoking a cigarette, and nobody was telling him he couldn't. And I thought, that's taking it a bit too far, personally. But when they came back 20 years later, the 14-year-old was now running the whole county program for juvenile offenders.
mm,
He'd learned to read and write, he'd got a degree, he'd gone on, and he was motivated. And you saw how kindness had worked. Now, their recidivism rate was 10% from Pepper Harrow. Only 1 in 10 of them reoffended. 80% after the short, sharp shock was introduced under Margaret Thatcher by William Whitelaw. I think quoting from operetta about executing people will give them a short, sharp shock. It's the Mikado, isn't it? It just is a very model of a modern executioner. Um, just appalling, these attitudes of mind, thinking that by being cruel and brutal to people, you can create a happy society. You
yeah.
know,
Well, you're thinking they deserve punishment, um, and punish them even more than what they did. And, you don't care where they've come from. And I must say, it's sometimes hard to be kind to people that have a shield of anger,
Mm,
um, irritability from being traumatized themselves. So even if you want to be kind, it's kind of hard to do.
yeah.
So, but you're right, it goes a long way. I think if there's any reason I was relatively successful with working with these prison guys was I tried to be kind to them,
Mm,
um, interested, empathetic, and kind, and that goes a long way. I think it went a long way with whoever I was seeing in psychiatry.
yeah.
If I didn't develop a good relationship with them where they thought I cared and wasn't going through the motions, you know, kindness was an essential part of it. I, I, I've probably given this example more than once on our interviews, but one of my most striking memories as a psychiatrist was picking up somebody in a waiting room who was waiting with other patients, looked like it was a middle-aged black lady, um, coming out to get her, bring her into my office, and she says, "I'm really glad you're my psychiatrist." This was pre-internet, and kind of nicely, as a psychiatrist is want to do, I answered with a question. Well, I'm really pleased to say that, but why? You don't know
Mm,
me. And said, well, you were the only psychiatrist that came out and smiled when they saw their patient. Okay. If that isn't the simplest way to be nice and kind, I don't know what is.
mm,
And but at least she perceived other psychiatrists weren't doing that,
mm,
So yeah, I've always thought that's really important, and a lot can be made up for what happened to somebody in their background, and kindness is part of making up for that and establishing new relationships. And what we have in the brain, because you mentioned these different points of view, we have plasticity, which
mm,
we actually didn't realize decades ago. I went to medical school, and we were told your brain is fixed. The neurons are fixed; they can't be changed. And the idea that you could develop new systems of neurons to
mm,
sort of get around what was already there, that was thought to be impossible. Well, it's not.
mm,
That plasticity is there as long as you can work with somebody or outside of formal therapy, just like you said, neuroplasticity is still available. You don't need a clinician to have that happen. If you have both, then you're really fortunate.
mm,
If you have a therapist when it's really severe, plus community support and kindness, your odds of getting better are pretty high. By the way, PTSD by itself, and especially if there's moral injury associated with it, is really hard to treat in formal psychiatry.
yeah.
Maybe the hardest of any disorder. So
Mm,
so we're missing something essential in treating that. And your idea of post-traumatic growth and strength, I think that's often part of what's missing. And the belief that people can actually get better and stronger. Now, you don't want people to have to go through trauma for that to happen,
no,
but trauma at different levels is always there. So you
mm,
want people to be able to at least grow from what they go through that's traumatic, from micro traumas on up to the bigger ones where you're fighting in war and your life's at complete risk. So um, it's a way of viewing trauma that's really really important.
yeah, absolutely. And if we go back to the root word trauma or trauma, I had a friend and he wrote a book called Rama Trauma Trump, and I couldn't understand why he'd written it. And then I heard him pronounce it Rama Trauma Trump. Oh, okay. The word means a wound, and it's just one of those words that's been glibly moved over,
Yes.
and it makes it sound, really important. One is wounded, and wounds can, you know, they can heal. You can have a scar, and you can show the scar off to your friends to say, "See, I
Mhm.
survived this. I manage this. But there are Sufis, Muslim Sufis, who pray on a daily basis for harm to come to them so that they can grow, so that they can
Mm,
overcome this and become something more. The
mm.
story of the Buddha, the idea that he'd grown up in an environment where he was shielded from old age, disease, and death.
Yeah,
And then one day he goes out and he sees these things. And only by being aware of them will you get beyond them because they're going to happen to you.
they're going right.
And
And,
developing an attitude towards them, I think he was a bit extreme, um, abandoning his newborn child and giving him the name Hindrance before cutting off all of his hair with a sword. I wouldn't cut my hair off with a sword. I think that's foolish. But and then living on 1 grain of rice a day and all of these wonderful stories about him. But there, if we can digest and integrate the experience we've had, Nietzsche was wrong when he said what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Being hit in the head with a baseball bat doesn't make you stronger, even if you survive. So it's nonsense. And he spent the last 15 years of his life in a psychiatric institute with syphilis. Poor man. But what doesn't kill you can make you stronger. And I do think that I think we perhaps have more compassion if we've had the experience ourselves, which is why, bereavement counselors who've survived bereavement themselves have a particular empathy that is useful. And if we can integrate our experiences, I was really lucky. I spent 9 years in Scientology, and people go, "Oh no, that must have been awful." And it was like, no, I was a customer. I paid them money to mess with my head, but I was never one of the slaves. I wasn't, and I had no idea the awful conditions that people were living under to pour money into L. Ron Hubbard's bank account. He left
mhm.
$648 million, all of it taken from Scientology. But I was so lucky. I came through that experience with so little harm, and it meant that I was able to stand up, and I couldn't
Mm,
understand why nobody else was.
mm.
This was like, they'll come after you if you do that. But it was often because people, it was generally because people had been traumatized. They'd gone for therapy, they'd gone to improve and become superhuman. And in fact, they'd been, you know, made less and less able to think for themselves, less and
Yeah,
less able to, Freud, when he criticized the practice that would become Dianetics, said, which was the starting point for Josef Breuer and where analysis began. But it's the method that's used to this day in Scientology. And when Freud talked about it in the Worcester, Massachusetts lectures in 1909, he said the problem is it's the opposite of therapy. It makes people more dependent on the therapist. And
mm.
you can see L. Ron Hubbard kind of rubbing his hands when he read that and going, "Oh, we'll try that."
Yeah, yeah. Adapted for some other use.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the subject that you bring up is so important because it spreads the potential for people helping one another, certainly outside of formal psychiatry.
Hmm.
And there's several essential elements that I think we've touched upon. One of them is that people have been traumatized have a way to ventilate about it,
Hmm.
talk about it, mourn about it. Um, the other is that there's a supportive community that really wants them to get better, not to be controlled, like you just mentioned in a
Hmm.
cult, but they want them to become more independent and healthy. And then the third factor is the person who's been traumatized actually needs to change their worldview a little bit and values.
Hmm.
It's sort of like, well, what have you learned from going through this trauma that can be avoided or help you grow better?
Hmm.
So, to me, those are the three essential elements. They're available outside of formal treatment for sure. Um, and some people help others just naturally using those three things, but most anybody who's relatively healthy can help other people using keeping those three therapeutic kind of
Yeah.
modalities in mind. Help somebody mourn when they've been traumatized, help them readjust their view of the world and form a community of support around them.
Mm.
And they got a good chance of getting post-traumatic growth or strength. I guess that's another word that's used. Resilience, strength, growth,
Mm.
um, coming out better out of all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, George Bonanno's work, I think, has been really interesting, and it's scientifically valid that he's been looking at PTSD and saying, I think we may be overstating this. I think if, with follow-up, people do tend to recover, and you can put them into an environment where they don't. You can put them into an environment. We have a situation with former members of authoritarian cults, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Scientologists, and they are encouraged to testify about the abuse they suffered. They go out and they keep talking about the awful things that happened to them. Now, I'm very hesitant. I was approached just over a week ago by a young man who came out of Scientology in January, and I
Mm,
knew that he'd already done video recordings with people. So he was put in touch with me by our mutual friend Steve Hassan, and he's done a show with Steve, lovely guy called Amir. And my concern was to talk to him rather than to record a show with him, because I wanted to be sure that he was okay,
mm,
that he was not going to become a celebrity victim.
mm,
And he is. He seems to be in very good shape. And so we went ahead and recorded something, and it's already gone up on my channel. And absolutely shocking things are happening in Scientology in Edinburgh, even as we speak. Absolutely shocking that they have about 25 people working there, and half of them are under the age of 16,
wow.
should be
Mm,
in school and are working full time without pay. So,
mm,
and they can sue me if they don't like me saying that. um, but that's how confident I am. But it's very important that what often happens is that somebody leaves an abusive relationship, we can call it that, an abusive group, and there's a media interest, especially now we've got YouTube and all of this going on,
yeah.
to actually put them out there, and it's like a freak show that
Hmm.
they're being displayed, and it is in their interest to maintain their disability.
Oh, yeah. You actually see that all the time, at least in the United States, on news programs, the major news programs. You'll see somebody interviewed on the street and blah, blah, and they're just being made actually into a freak show. you
Yeah,
know, they like it. It makes them feel important. They can get their story out, but they don't have the support we're just talking about, and they're not mourning what they've gone through. And so it's not a help for growth or strength. It's you're actually abusing them in a different way.
yeah.
And so, but you just see that on the regular news all the time,
Mm.
with everyday people like protesters.
Yeah, and it's exploitative, and
Yeah.
you know what I when documentary makers come to me, I've had this is my 43rd year of doing this one way or another. Um, so I've talked with a lot of people in the media. I lost count somewhere about 250, you know, media outlets that I've talked with since 1984 when I first spoke to the Daily Mail in March 84. And the journalist there, he stopped me in full spate. He said, "No, John, you don't understand. We want a victim and a picture."
Mhm.
And so when documentary makers come to me, and they do, and say they want to do something about Scientology or, you know, totalitarian groups or what have you, I say, well, look, there are four elements here, and you're going to have to touch on one of them, or I'm not going to work with you. So it's not a matter of whether you're going to pay me or not. I'm not going to work with you unless you show how people are recruited, why they stay, how they leave, or how they can recover. I want at least one of those elements, and
Mm.
very few documentary makers have been interested in that.
Really. Mm.
Um, so, and I think that's it's a blight on our society that
Yeah.
because you can, when you see, we go back to the Paralympics, you can suffer awful, awful trauma, you know, lose a limb or, in a terrible situation. And yet, through the resilience of the human spirit, the human self, you can turn that into something. You can make something of it. That there's Viktor Frankl tells a story talking about his logotherapy, where he met a young man who was quadriplegic because of a car accident.
Hmm.
And he said to him, what an awful thing to have happened to you. And the young man said, I cared about nothing before this happened to me. I was a
Hmm.
bad person, and now I'm not. So yeah, it's incredibly sad that I can't move my limbs, but I was an awful person, and now I'm not. And so I'm really not advocating that as a form of therapy. I want everybody to know, but and and I have nothing but sympathy for those people who have been turned into celebrity victims and not been given the chance to recover. So, my policy and that of various of my colleagues is we're not going to publish an interview with somebody that's about their therapeutic journey. We're not going to have them tell their story to the camera. I'm not interested in doing that because it can fix it. It's almost like fixing a photograph, the silver nitrate
Yeah.
exposed to light will be fixed.
Yeah. Gets kind of
And makes it harder
reinforced.
to get back. I'm sorry?
Yeah, it gets reinforced,
Yeah.
feels like positive reinforcement, but yeah, it's you know, in, in a way, it's also hard to blame the media because what gets the public attention is the bad stuff. you know, the trauma,
Mm.
the destruction, and so forth. So for news shows to get more viewers, they have to show this bad stuff. The one news show we watch on TV around dinner time has 27 minutes of bad stuff and at the end 3 minutes of good stuff. And they almost admit they have this discrepancy because that's what people want. And we
Mm.
want it because that's part of our human nature. We react the most strongly to bad stuff because it feels dangerous, even though it may not be, but it feels dangerous. So our fight and flight response goes into motion and we pay attention. And,
Mm.
so for news channels to ever give up this apparent need to show the bad stuff, it's, it's, it's a hard thing to overcome when you're concerned with your own financial, viability. But it's not helpful people, and it's certainly not helpful to people in what you've brought up, to enhance post-traumatic growth and strength. Only focusing or mainly focusing on the trauma and destruction and bad stuff. All that does is really reinforce that remaining and
Mm.
reinforces people preoccupation with it. So
Yeah, and if we move outside of the news, it's another cop show about a serial killer and another cop show about a serial killer.
mhm,
And when you start looking at the psychology of the copycat, and since the 50s, there have been very good studies
yeah,
supporting this idea. And again, the American Psychological Association, after every school shooting, goes to the media and says, please don't publicize this.
mhm,
And here's a conundrum. In the United States, you have a school shooting about two a week.
mm,
In this country, we've only ever, in the United Kingdom, in fact, we've only ever had one.
mm.
It's
That
just,
make
whereas when you roll back, our gun laws were the same as the US in 1950.
were they? Oh,
Yep, pretty much.
mm,
And we got stricter and stricter gun laws because of the worry about criminals having guns. We still 95% of our police do not carry weapons. They don't carry guns. They don't have to. And looking at that comparison, and I think some of it is socially created.
Mm.
So the idea of the serial killer has been popularized.
Yeah.
And the reality is that there aren't that many of them.
Hmm.
There are, in fact, there are probably more shows with serial killers in than there are actual serial killers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and when Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand said that she was never going to name the perpetrator of a crime, a heinous attack on I think it was a Muslim community, and that was an interesting idea. Don't make celebrities out of them.
Right.
Don't give them that status. But also, yeah, that I read all sorts of things all the time. We have 20 books on the go. I've been reading Roman history because I'm worried about fascism, being restyled populism in our society, neo-traditionalism, these ideas that we need to return to some golden age of the past and make everything great again, just like it was when,
Yeah. When. Right.
you know. Um, Donald Trump has said that it was during the Gilded Age. In fact, he's given precise dates. He's in just before he became president in January. He said it was from 1870 to 1913. Well, it wasn't from 1865 to 1917, which seemed more natural dates in American history, but uh, from the end of the Civil War to the entry into the World War One. But this is a time of rapacious capitalism. This is the
Hmm.
time when super fortunes were made by the Vanderbilts and Carnegies, and on to the Gettys and Fords. And people worked a 6 day, 12-hour a day week. They might have a half day on Saturday. The injuries in the factories were horrific.
Hmm.
So this Gilded Age functioned for the super rich. And
Hmm.
this thought that we're returning to that. The Russians, Alexander Dugin is one of Putin's advisors, and he's put forward this idea of neo-traditionalism, which confused me greatly. I knew oldness. It's like, that doesn't make any sense to me. It can't be both of those things at the same time, new and old. The new form of oldness, geriatric youthfulness. But I couldn't understand from his talks what he was talking about. I spent several hours watching this man talking, and I had no idea. I knew he was very influential, and so I read one of his little books. Thankfully, it was little, and found out that what the Russians are pushing towards is to reclaim not simply the Tsarist society, but the society of Ivan the Terrible. They want serfdom back, and when you start looking to white nationalism, or indeed black nationalism, any kind of nationalism that's racist, we start saying, well, we want to be the Übermensch and you will be the Untermensch. We want to be in a position of power and you can be our servants and slaves. You can do as you're told. That division has happened so rapidly, really since Ronald Reagan
Hmm.
became president. I know there was a statistic Naomi Klein gives that in 1981, the average CEO had an income of 40 times that of a blue collar worker. By 2000, it was 411 times that of a blue collar worker. And at the same time, there. So, anyway, long preamble, as ever. Uh, I've been interested in the origins of fascism. Fascism, term used by Mussolini. Before him, it was used with a different meaning. So he invents this idea of fascism where he will be Il Duce, he will be the princely lord who 3 times a day, every day, will attack a woman. That was part of Benito Mussolini's daily regime. And everybody will do as they're told. And he looked back to the great Roman Empire. Let's recreate the Roman Empire. Now, reading about the Roman Empire, I would not like to have lived in a place where 1/3 of all the people were slaves, where
Hmm.
all of the military campaigns were in fact to gather slaves, where the
Hmm.
slaves had absolutely no rights whatsoever. You could do whatever you wanted to them, and where the Roman population don't work. They live upon the bread that's being given to them, and they go to circuses. And in these circuses, we were in the Hippodrome in Constantinople, Istanbul, a couple of years ago, incredible. And thinking about these chariot racers and the idea that they would put people into the arena and set wild animals on them.
mm,
That entertainment then, now people watch serial killer porn.
mm,
And then it was, this says something awful about human nature that
mhm.
means that we need to be a lot more careful than we are being, not in a kind of nanny state, but in terms of helping people towards kindness, helping people towards the understanding that if you are unkind, he who lives by unkindness will die by unkindness. And
Yeah,
she as well. I don't want to be sexist about this. She who lives by unkindness will die by unkindness. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword. That the only way forward for our species is to
yeah.
have care and concern, and that if we appoint people who are vicious and brutal, who want to create a warrior culture, because when they were little boys they never got to win, and I think taking Pete Hegseth behind the bike sheds and giving him a good kicking to show him what violence actually does. No, I don't actually advocate that. But seeing somebody who has the mentality of a 7-year-old in command of one of the vastest armies, or the vastest army the world has ever seen, is terrifying. Somebody who wants to punish other people,
Hmm.
wants all the generals to do push-ups so they're fit, and then brings Donald Trump on stage, who never done a push-up in his life. Um, there is something very twisted happening in this idea of being cruel to other people. It is what we call sociopathy, and we now see it, and we've always seen it in the halls of government.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, because it's a reaction to usually being hurt yourself growing up and feeling
Post-traumatic
unloved.
stress. Yeah.
We have this inbuilt tendency to fear other people, but it can be overcome. It just
Mm,
can't be overcome just automatically. It has to be a matter of attention, matter of child rearing, a
mm,
matter of education in school. But it's not hopeless. We can overcome that tendency to fear others and try to
mm,
get power over them. I mean, even in young babies, you can see these two tendencies. One, to demand what they think they need and get angry. The other is to be altruistic of other little babies.
mm,
And which the parent reinforces is crucial, absolutely crucial. But we have that potential, but hopefully, hopefully we can exert more of it now because the dangers are just escalating. The dangers, whether it's of nuclear war, the environment, AI, whatever, the dangers are much higher and much greater than they used to be.
mm,
And so if we don't find ways to enhance our kinder selves, we're we're just going to kill ourselves off. Um,
mm.
Maybe be left with a few powerful people and all their slaves, as you've mentioned. So,
Right, I'm going to go and block up the ventilation shafts on their bunkers. It's quite simple. They cannot. This idea, it's happening. The super rich are buying islands and building bunkers. They are
that's right.
preparing.
They'll survive it.
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
Only they won't, because we'll find their ventilation shafts, and that's the end of them. Sorry. So very simple. We'll pour custard down the ventilation shafts until they all drown. Um,
Yeah.
yes, the to pursue kindness, to achieve a level of kindness, which doesn't mean not losing our tempers. It doesn't mean it means realizing intelligently. When I've had to deal with sociopaths, and I'm afraid in this world you do, you have to point out their advantage to them.
Hmm.
Not, how wonderful everybody will think they are or what have you, but how much money they'll make, or, what the advantage is to them, and bring them into line that way. If we could persuade our politicians that we're only going to vote for them if they do stuff that we like, instead of this, we're just seeing craziness in this country. Our leading political parties, the Conservatives, the New Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are polling third, fourth, and fifth in
Mm.
public surveys. Our two extreme groups, Reform, who we're terrified of because they used to be the United Kingdom Independence Party. They want splendid isolation and to do whatever Trump tells them to do, which is a little bit of a contradiction there. And of course, we're backed by Elon Musk. We've now outlawed him giving money directly to them.
Uh,
But on the other hand, we have a Green Party, which sounds great until you start looking at its politics, and its politics are ultra left.
mm.
And so the centre, you know, centre will not hold, as W.B. Yeats quoted from some Roman poet, that anarchy
Yeah,
is loosed upon the world.
yeah. It's so hard to imagine what political system will work better. I mean, United States, we have, as you know, just two essential parties. That's it.
Mhm.
Everything else is fringe. So you're set up for conflict right away,
Yeah,
inevitable. And
yeah.
that's why our governments go back and forth between Republicans and Democrats.
Mm.
In Israel, you have all these parties. Well, what's come out of it? The rule by the most extreme Orthodox Jews right now has come out of that.
Mm.
So that doesn't protect you from the worst. You mentioned Great Britain. And so, what kind of political system could potentially make things better? Um, I don't know if it's out there, but the ones we're talking about have a long ways to go, you know.
They are, and I mean Churchill um, said, what a terrible system democracy is, but it's much better than any of
But,
the others. And he also said, "Jaw jaw is better than war war." Having heard Donald Trump say that our current premier is not Winston Churchill, and it's true, he's not. He's much taller than Winston Churchill was. You couldn't mistake them one for the other. But um, Churchill, despite his many failings, and I'm working on a project about that too at the moment. Everything's
oh,
all over the
good,
place.
good, good.
Um, we probably won't get anywhere because nobody wants to talk about his many failings. He's such a hero.
Mm,
But despite his many failings, he didn't throw Britain into war. War had already been declared before he became premier in
mm,
May 1940. War was declared in September 1939. He, in fact, when Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich and said, bit of paper, peace in our time, he congratulated him publicly on his
mm.
achievement. It became, he was later to say that he knew that Chamberlain would fare badly in history because he was going to write the history, but they'd actually worked together very closely. But so, yeah, George Orr is better than War War. I think the problem in democracy is that you're going to have the bread and circuses. You're going to have people whose vote can be bought. We need,
or the
I,
people or the people can be ignored. I mean, that's what's happening in the United States.
mm,
Essentially, the people's point of view is being ignored,
mm,
and lots of people with political interests and preoccupation are wondering whether the current administration is going to potentially set up military law or something to alter our election process.
yep,
Just alter it to their advantage,
yep.
obviously. So, but so much is going on, especially the war, that has just been made because the president wanted to. It wasn't People weren't involved, consulted, or anything about it. So that's not much of a democracy.
No, it's not anything. And I mean, here, one of our right-wing politicians, Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, who held many senior positions in government, said we live in an elective dictatorship. You elect the dictators. And so Trump saying, you gave me a mandate. I may, in fact, have got less than 50% of the electorate to vote for me,
Mm,
but as only 60% of the electorate voted anyway.
that,
So, I mean, I worked on a thing with my niece-in-law, and she was doing a master's degree years ago. And I gave her the title in the end which was how much democracy is enough. Because she was doing a dissertation on democracy, so she sent out surveys, and she was amazed at how few people responded to the surveys. And it was like, there's the answer.
Mm,
Um, what people who will become involved and why will they become involved? And that tangle of, my focus these many years is authoritarianism in whatever form, where people determine that they are gods on earth and should be listened to, the bullies, or where people decide that they don't know enough, so they'll let the bullies do it. They believe in
that's
other
right.
people's certainty.
You get some kind of certainty, which is very comfortable to people.
Mm,
Speaking of elections, we in organized psychiatry in the United States, we have our own elections, of
mm,
officers, most officers, not all of them, president, so forth, so on. No constrictions on us. Nobody's scared of the leaders. What's the percentage of psychiatrists who voted these elections? Probably 15%, 20% of all psychiatrists. So here we are in a field that, you know, democracy definitely lives in the organization, and psychiatrists don't care about it. Whatever happens, happens, is sort of the attitude. Um, and and there are differences in leaders who run. It's not like they're all the same. So, but we don't exert our democratic rights in our own organization.
mm. Fascinating. Yeah, what a
Yeah.
thought. What a thought. And so it is about changing people's minds to a point where they realize it's in their own interests to do things that are in their own interests.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Uh,
the education about all of this, to make things better is so essential, but
mm,
so hard to get out there and for people to hear about it, understand it, and put it into motion.
mm.
The the change aspects are just daunting, possible but daunting.
And I felt for a long time that it could be done very quickly. That we just and I set about developing a course for 11 and 12-year-olds to teach them how to recognize human predators. It's simple enough. How to understand propaganda, that, when somebody's trying to sell something to you, and how to look at, how to pass the news so that you can see whether it's fake or not. And there are some things that are very obvious and they're not being taught. I've seen what Google and people put out as their projects on this. It's like, you're kidding me. So
No,
I've been teaching about these things for decades now. But getting it into the school system, if you get enough 11-year-olds to
that's
see that,
that's the hard part. Getting in the school system or getting what parents should be doing to them so that they do it. I mean, this is just a horrible situation I just read about regarding kids in Qatar and what they're taught. I read about it because it has something to do with the war going on now. And the kids growing up there in Qatar are taught to hate Jews and Israel. That Jews are animals, devils, blah, blah, blah.
mm,
Well, how are these kids going to grow up to ever be able to have peaceful relationship with Jews in Israel when they're taught that in school and by their parents? It's impossible,
mm.
you know. So, but the school system, yeah, that's where change could be made if you can get in there and use it correctly.
Yeah, and I think we can bypass the the system, and I've felt this for a long time. I just have never been able to get the funding to do these courses, which would just cost a few $1,000s to make. And I, keep coming up against a wall in terms of doing this. And in terms of how we are conditioned to hate other people,
Hmm.
there's a documentary, I think, on YouTube called Defamation, which was made by an Israeli who was interested in the term anti-Semitism. And he went and asked his grandma. He starts the film with this and says, "Grandma, what does anti-Semitic mean?" And she said, "Oh, that's Jews that don't live in Israel.
Huh.
They're all criminals."
Whoa.
And so he moved on and he goes to the Anti-Defamation League in the US and they let him film, not realizing that he's a neutral. He's not, a Zionist or somebody who's fervent about something. He's just trying to answer a question. And he gets some very strange things during the course of this film. The end of the film, he goes to Auschwitz with a party of Israeli school children. And you see them all, these 15-year-olds all happy going in, and then they see the bags and shoes, the teeth, the things. And by the time they come out, they're completely traumatized. And what they're being told is you've got to watch Goyim, all of them, all of the time, because they've done this before and they will do it again. And the Mossad guy who's gone with them goes on camera and he's saying, I don't know why we teach our kids these awful things.
Mhm.
So, you've got to be taught to hate. So we watched South Pacific the other week. What a glorious piece of work that is. You've
No,
got
see
to be,
that's not true. The tendency to hate is right there in us from the beginning.
yeah, but
What you've got to be taught is not to hate.
well, the song in South Pacific, you've got to be taught
Yeah,
to hate. It's what our
no, I know
education
that
system's
song.
about.
It
Yeah.
sounds like it's right, but it's really only half of the
I can't change Oscar
explanation.
Hammerstein's lyrics. I'm sorry. That would be, you know, that would be blasphemous. But you haven't got to be, and as you say, you're exactly right. You've got to be taught not to, that the tendency to be frightened of strangers,
or
xenophobic.
or hate when it's appropriate. There are times when it's appropriate to hate, right? I mean, um, but you need to be able to recognize those and then what to do about it, which isn't going to cause bigger hatred and more hatred. But
Yeah,
uh,
I hate the sin, but love the sinner. Um, I'm not sure there is any time when you should hate another person. But it's pulling apart what that, we should be indignant, but
mhm,
not angry. So it's probably semantic on my part,
right,
but
right, right,
we should feel opposition towards awful things and stupidity
yeah.
and hatred itself. We the only thing that we should be intolerant of is intolerance,
Well,
as Isaiah Berlin put it.
there was a interesting idea that came out of popular Jewish author recently, Dara Horn. She wrote the book "People Love Dead Jews." The trouble with this book, she admitted, was that she didn't have any solution for that solution for the hatred toward Jews. But after the book came out in many months, she finally came up with an idea, and she said the opposite of hatred is actually curiosity.
Mm,
That if you're curious about other people and other things, that's the antidote to hatred.
mm,
Um, because again, people will naturally, without information, tend to hate
yeah.
because they feel others are dangerous to them. But if you get them curious about things, I I had I had a different experience with anti-Semitism from what you just mentioned, but it was actually just a variation on the same theme.
Mm.
So, yeah, you know this. So I did a book on anti-Semitism psychiatry. You did a wonderful, cautious chapter. I think you did it in most of the books. Be careful about these religions.
It's my job.
Um, there could be cultish aspects of them,
Mm,
or they can be cults themselves. But anyways, the book came out. It came in the mail, and I was going out to eat with my wife and a couple to celebrate. We went to this restaurant that worked with the Jewish Community Center, so certainly knew Jews and knew what we were concerned with. We get there, we meet the wife of the owner as they're getting a table, and she sees the book and she says, "What's anti-Semitism?" And I'm just taken aback. What's anti-Semitism? You don't already know. You've been dealing with Jews for years, and you don't know what
mm,
anti-Semitism means. I mean, I will say this to myself, and then we spent the next half hour trying to educate her about it. But
mm.
it's like a person who's not Jewish who you think would know about anti-Semitism, and she did seem concerned once she heard what it meant. Didn't know. It's just ignorant.
Yeah, yeah, it is. That's an absolutely amazing thought. My father grew up in the Anglican confession of the Christian Church, but in 1945, he was with the group that liberated Belsen.
Oh,
So
really?
whenever he was asked what his religion was, he would say, "I'm Jewish."
Mm, mm.
Like, um, so
But the
yeah,
talk
awful,
about
terrible things.
trauma. Being a soldier in that situation was also traumatic in its own way.
Yeah, he was also at Normandy and Dunkirk. Um, and for 10 years after the war, he would wake up screaming with
Yeah,
nightmares. Um, but uh, I'm very happy to report that the last dozen years of his life, he lived a very contented existence. You know,
good,
he'd um, he'd absorbed that,
good.
and I'm also pleased to report that during that period, I got to know him finally,
Yeah.
and
Mm,
to respect him. Um,
good.
yes, well, I think we've solved nearly all of the problems of the world
Of
today,
course.
yet again.
Or we told other people how to solve the problem.
That's it. Somebody should do something about that.
Yeah, if
One of
only.
my brothers said, we should have a website called "Somebody Should Do Something About That." So
That's a good name.
who is that somebody? Well, lovely to talk with you as ever, dear friend, and hopefully some people will say some things, and we'll maybe take notice of them. Who knows?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
answer things. Um, I'm sure Spike goes through comments. If there are questions, then we would be very happy to address them. We
definitely.
really would.
Yeah, I love those. I love questions and comments.
Yeah, me too. I had a thing on my Imbialik's breakdown, which went up last week, and it's a huge channel. We get hundreds or a few thousand views here, but it was quite interesting to be in this other place. And there are all of these comments. I think I've answered about 300 comments. So a couple of people told me off because I'm not entirely positive about Barack Obama. How dare I suggest
Uh,
that he had feet of clay? Um, and a couple of people were very concerned that I suggest that the transcendental meditation isn't a good idea. So I'd like to say that again here. Transcendental meditation isn't a very good idea. There you go. Um, it's not so you don't need somebody to teach you to repeat a word until you go into a dizzy trance. The poet Wordsworth had worked this one out and said he'd just say Wordsworth, 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 Wordsworth until he tripped out. It's like I'm not sure how much benefit there is to it, but you know, people take drugs to get high, so obviously people want to get high. So saying a word over and over, maybe I don't know. Uh,
yeah, that's the beauty of being part of publication or presentation that draws lots of viewers and has a
hmm,
comment section because you sort of get a feel for what viewers are thinking,
yeah,
and and if 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 it's a smaller viewed number, yeah, still could happen,
hmm.
but if you have a, a publication or a video or whatever, and you don't have a comment section, I think you're really missing something important. But
I do too. The other week there was a BBC Food thing where a dietitian said these are five ultra processed foods that you need in your diet. And I looked at the five foods and went, none of them are ultra processed. They're all processed, but they
uh,
don't have preservatives in them or stabilizers or emulsifiers, which is what makes for. And I went, where do I write this? And
yeah,
there was no comments
no,
section.
no,
I'm still annoyed about it now.
yeah, yeah, they didn't want any comment. Yeah,
No. So it goes. Anyway, great, good fun as ever. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for spending your time with us today.
yeah, thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.